Hello everyone, welcome back. JavaMentor.net here. In this video, let's learn what is the ORM tool, JPA and Hibernate specifically. So you remember in the past, we worked with a database. We connected our application to the database and we created SQL queries in this fashion. Then when we receive a result set, we were extracting data from that result set and putting inside this book object, right? But can you imagine that this book has, let's say, every book can be written by multiple authors, right? So something like this. What query would look like? Well, you would need to do some joins, and then result in this result set will be in some weird shape. You would need to extract that data and then to create book object, to create multiple authors inside that book object, and then you would need to manually do that mapping. You can try for the homework to do that. Create author table in the database, then connect book and author using foreign key. We learned about that when we learned about SQL. And then you can try to create SQL query that joins those two tables and extract the data and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, inside Java, we have objects. Book is object. This list of authors is one field in the book object. Author is also an object. Book is class, but author is class also, but you got the point. We are dealing with objects in our Java, and inside SQL we are managing rows, so they are not in the same shape. We need some mapping between them, between objects and relations. And that's what object relational mappers are doing. They're doing mapping between SQL databases and objects. The most popular ORM mapper for Java is Hibernate. And you can think of Hibernate as one implementation, and JPA, that is Java Persistence API, that is some interface, some specification. And Hibernate implements JPAs. In this tutorial, let's create one use case that works, and then in the following tutorial, because we will have at least 5, 6 or more tutorials regarding Hibernate in JPA, we will explain how it works under the hood, what's the point, what should you care about, and so on and so on. Step number 1, as usual, you need to add dependencies. So this is the Spring Boot Starter Data JPA dependency. Then you should go Gradle build as usual stuff, and then you want to say that one book can have multiple authors, right? So first of all, we don't have author class, so let's create that. Author, and let's say that author has string ID and author has private string name. Getters and setters. Okay, that's our author. How should we tell to Java or to JPA that this book class holds mapping between some object and some relation? In this case, it will hold mapping between book class and book table, so that this title will be mapped to some title in the database. The answer is we need to put here on the class @entity annotation from Jakarta persistence package. Okay, now you remember in the database every table has a primary key, right? So what is the primary key for the book? Well, ESBN is the primary key. ESBN cannot be null and it needs to be unique for every book, right? So we need to mark that as ID. Also from Jakarta persistence. All annotations for JPA are coming from this Jakarta persistence package. Okay, we did good job for book. So those two annotations are the only two annotations that are mandatory. Also, we need to mark this as an entity because there will be author table in the database, and we need to mark ID as an ID. Now here in the book we can see that one book can have multiple authors, right? For that reason, we want to say one to many. One book can have many authors. So we're putting this annotation. This is not the best way. I'll show you in the following tutorials a better way, but it's easiest to understand. Now the last thing that we need is some repository that will fetch us those books from the database, right? So let's name it book JPA repository. I mean, convenient name would be book repository, but we already have one book repository currently. We need to create in the repository. We already have one repository currently, our legacy code from the past, so we will name this book JPA repository so we don't need to delete our old one. So we need to extend CRUD repository. This is Spring data repository package, so it's not coming from Jakarta, because now we are putting together JPA, Spring and everything. I mean, JPA can work alone without Spring, but in our first use case, first task, we want to create together JPA, Spring, and just to make it work, and later on we will explain what's going on. This CRUD repository, it has two generics as a parameters. It will ask what is the entity that I work with. So you want to say you are working with book. And then the second parameter is what is the ID type of that book. You want to say it's string. String, ESBN is string. And also, since this is an interface, we should either implement here, but in that case we need to override few more methods, but a better way would be to say extends, and we want to mark this as an interface, right? So we are creating a repository interface, and that interface extends another interface. And in this fashion, now our book JPA repository has a lot of methods, a lot of useful methods that are coming from CRUD repository. You can save one entity to the database. You can save multiple entities. You can find by ID. You can check does it exist by ID, and so on and so on. You can count elements, delete by ID, basically all basic CRUD operations. CRUD is acronym for create. Now the interesting thing is that we will not create a class that will implement this book JPA repository. That's a little bit weird. You may ask, okay, if we don't create a class, which class will be invoked? How we will create an object of an interface? And you're totally right, I do understand you, but we will wire this as a dependency, and then under the hood, Spring created a class that is implementing this interface, and Spring is handling implementation. We just need to create specification, declaration, and we are doing that here. Also interesting to mention that we don't need to put @repository @service or any @bin Spring annotation. Spring will handle this. It will create bin out of this repository automatically. We don't need to care about that. Okay, the next thing is here, instead of our old book repository, we want to put book JPA repository. This getting book by author is a complex query for now, so we will comment this method for a second. We will implement it later. For now, let's just create one method that will return us book based on ID, right? So public get by ID, we are passing ID as a parameter, and we want to say book repository find by ID. And you'll see that this is returning optional, right? So it might happen that that book doesn't exist in the database with that ID. In that case, we want to throw exception, right? For example, in our case, runtime exception book with that ID does not exist. And of course here it's a good idea to say book with which ID. So you want to concatenate here in this fashion. Book with ID does not exist. Okay, so we have get by ID method. And now let's get back to our book controller. And I created one method to get book by ID. I passed ID through the URL as a path variable. Take a note, this is not request param. We are also passing request params through the URL, but they are passed after the question mark. This is directly through the variable, through the URL using path variable. Before starting our application, we just need to add few properties. So I went here to application.properties file, and we need three properties: URL, username, and password, in the same fashion like previously for SQL database. Now just make sure that this time you have this spring.datasource.url property and .username.password, because those properties will be read for Spring and JPA persistence. You need to put the same values as previously that we put for our SQL database. Also, we need two more properties regarding Hibernate. This one is very hard to explain to beginners. If you want to learn more about that, feel free to take a look at this Stack Overflow question. It's explained in details what's going on, but basically it's a disaster if you don't do this. And this one is, you will see later that we will generate database model based on JPA annotations. So to be able to do that, you need to set this property to update. Okay, now this should work. Let's give it a try. Let's go debug and let's find one ID in our database. Okay, in our database we only have one book and the ISBN ID of that book is this one. So let's go to the Postman and let's say here this. And let's see what will happen. Exception will happen. It says column does it have a hard cover does not exist. So we want to take a look at this column. You can see here that we have a field called does it have a hard cover, right? So we have field inside our class, but we don't have that field inside our SQL table, right? And that's what Java is complaining about. Now, what's the thing here? Usually, when people use this JPA on their projects, they introduce JPA from the beginning, and then they create all the tables and all the classes from the beginning in the fashion that object model and relation model match. Now, I first showed you this SQL without JPA, so we have a mismatch now. What we can do, we can go here to book, we can manually add few columns, but even better thing is, since we are just practicing, just learning, and we don't have any important data, I deleted all tables, and then I will stop my application and start it again. And on the startup, JPA will create tables based on those annotations. So it will look for entity annotations, for all Jakarta annotations, and it will create you a database model. Now I have something called registered user and registered user authorities. That's for later, for the security. But we should focus on the first three tables: author, book, and book authors. So this author represents our author class, ID and name. Book represents book, and as you can see now, book has all of the fields. And book authors represents connection between author and book, that one-to-many annotation. So this book is, you can say book ID 1, author ID 1. Then again book ID 1, but now author ID 2, which means that book 1 is written by authors 1 and 2. Okay, this creating tables from the JPA annotations is okay for some lower environments, for example, dev and QA environments, but don't ever, please, don't ever turn on this creation from the annotations on the production, because you can screw up everything. For the serious work, for the production, you want to use some database migration tools such as Liquibase and Flyway and so on and so on. I won't show you that in this playlist, but basically you can Google Liquibase and then I don't know, some example, and you can find like how to do this Liquibase and everything with different kind of databases. Another good database migration tool is Flyway, and so on and so on. You can try to find how to use those stuff, but you don't need it for now. You just need to know that on production environments you should never ever enable this creating tables from JPA annotations. Okay, we are in training, we are learning, so we are allowed to do that. Let's add one book. Okay, let's get back to our code, and it's a good idea to create actually one endpoint for adding books first, because we have an empty database now, right? So get, if we want to insert new books, that is a post endpoint, right? So post mapping, and we want to say books, and here insert book, and then we need to go through the body, request body. We need some book request, insert book request, and let's say we will add value, Lombok value annotation here. I'll say string, book can have ID, book can have multiple authors, right? So it's list of string for authors, author IDs. Then book can have, yeah, this ID is actually ISBN. You may ask why we don't put this book as an input parameter to the controller, but we don't want to mix responsibilities. Responsibility of this book is to represent model of the database. We don't want this book to represent a model of our body inside our save new book endpoint. That doesn't make sense, because sometimes the fields won't be the same, and it's generally not advisable. If we put this book inside the request body, that would be a violation of single responsibility principle. Okay, we have some field here. I'm not sure what is that all about, but let's say just number of pages. That's the last important thing. So number of pages, and that's enough. We only want to add those three fields. Inside book service, we want to have one public void save method, book.set. Now we have this author ID from the past, and let's just for a second delete those few stupid fields that we have on the book. It really doesn't make sense and it bothers me. So we want to delete author ID because we have multiple authors now. Delete that one field, I'm not sure what is that all about, and save. And let's delete that here as well. So I want to delete author ID and I want to delete field. We want to set ISBN book request dot get ISBN. Now the next thing is we want to set authors. We need to provide list of authors. Now the thing is, we are inserting the book in this use case. So we need to already have authors in the database, right? We don't want to add authors now to create new authors in the same time when we are creating new book. Authors already need to be in the database. And for that reason, we would probably need to create author controller, author service, author repository, everything similar like for the book. But just to avoid that, to lose time, I will manually add few authors in our database. So I added 2 authors in my author table. Martin Fowler, very famous author regarding Java and regarding software development overall, and this Vlad Michalcea guy, he's also very good author, and his mainly topics are JPA and Hibernate and database, so you can check out his blog. He's very good. Okay, now we have authors in our database and we are trying to insert new book, right? And to set authors to that book. But the thing is, in the request, we only have author IDs, right? And here we need to provide list of authors, author objects, not strings. So we need somehow to map one ID to one author. But how to do that? One way is to read from the database. So take author ID, read the author from the database, and then put that author here. But if you look closely here, we actually only need the author ID. So connection between book and author ID is not author name. We don't need that. We only need to say this book ID is connected to this author ID. So this book is written by this author ID. We don't need author name. For that reason, we can do something like this. We can say book request that get author IDs. So take all author IDs and then stream through that map. We want to map string to author, right? So here we can say author equals new author, and author set ID s, and then we want to collect that list, and we have a list of authors here. For every author ID, we created author object, set ID, and return author. You may say, yes, but this author doesn't have a name. Will that impact the database somehow? Well, no. We only want to connect book with its authors, and for that connection we only need book ID and author's ID. We don't need author name, and JPA will recognize that. The last thing is we want to say book repositories dot save, and we want to save that book. So here in the insert book, let's finish this one. So insert book request, and we want to call save method, pass the request. When you don't want to return the value from your endpoint, you can put void class here, and then you can return null here. So you're basically returning nothing. You're just saving the things in the database. I mean, sometimes it's a good practice to return either true or false, like is it saved or not, but in this particular case doesn't make sense because you will return status code. So if status code is 200, then everything went well. Okay, let's try this to see if it works. We will first want to try to call this post mapping to insert one book, and then we will try to get that book by ID. Okay, we didn't finish this method, transforming book to the book response. Okay, I just fixed this. So now book response only have ISBN and number of pages. I didn't include author in this book response. I'll show you later why. For now, only ISBN and number of pages. Okay, let's start application now. Okay, our old book repository is complaining. Let's just delete this line that is complaining. So let's try again in the debug mode. We want to call books endpoint post method with this body. So we are trying to insert one book. Send 200. Let's check in the database. There is a new book. Number of pages is not set for some reason. Let's take a look why. So we were going, here, save request. Yeah, we forgot here to say set number of pages. and then book request dot get number of pages. Okay, we fixed that bug, but other than that, we can see that we have a book in our database and also book authors. We have a connection. So it says book ISBN, this one is written by this author and also this author. So for this book is the same USBN, you have two authors. Now let's try to fetch that data from the database. So we want to get book 555 and let's see what will be the answer. Well, we got the book from the database, number of pages is 0 because our data is bad, but if our data is good, this number of pages would be good as well. Now let's try to include author IDs in this book response. We want to show who are the authors of that book. Okay, we are going to book response. Let's just, for example, include their IDs. So author IDs, getter and setter. Now we want to stop application. Here also in book controller, we want to say here, book response dot set author IDs, and we want to say book. We want to get through authors, and then we want to stream from list of authors to create list of strings using stream map. Then we want to say here get ID and then collect to list, right? This is the Java Stream way of doing that. You can use method reference here. Yeah, these author IDs need to be a list of strings, not one string. So let's generate getters and setters again. Now it's fine. Let's start our application to see what will happen. Okay, if we try send, internal server error. Interesting. And let's see what's going on here. It says failed to lazily initialize a collection of role and then something. It says no session, book authors. So something was problematic when it comes to those authors. We have some lazy initialization exception, and this is expected. In the next video, let's talk about lazy and eager way of initializing our lists. See you in the next video.